All right. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good morning, folks. When the music stops, it feels like a good time to commence. Welcome to Race and United States Exceptionalism, a webinar brought to you by Malcolm Shanks and myself, Shweta Murthy. It's a really lovely, hot and humid day out in Chicago, and I'm hoping you all are finding comfort and rest wherever you are as you settle down for the next couple of hours with us. Before we really get into the content, just some Zoom things for Zoom and accessibility things for everyone to note. We have Joyful Signing with us today, helping us out with captioning as well as with ASL. We have Lindsay Stoker, who is our captioner. So if you are interested in closed captioning, please click that closed caption button at the bottom of the Zoom bar to activate captioning. ASL interpreters, Selena and Kathy should be spotlighted along with the speakers as the webinar goes on. If you're in need of any technical assistance related to access, instead of putting your question in the chat, please put it in the Q&A so that we're able to identify your question and help you out. My colleague Tanvi Singh will be the one doing that. Otherwise, we really encourage you to use the chat to keep on engaging with the content, with engaging with one another. Of course, if you have any questions for Malcolm and or myself related to the content itself, please use the Q&A feature to do that. So before we commence, I'm going to hand it off to Malcolm to proceed with the land acknowledgements. Malcolm.
Thank you, Shweta. Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening. Good morning to some of the folks who are west of California. I am really excited to be joining you. We're going to start grounding ourselves with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement, for those who may not be familiar, is a cultural, social, and spiritual and political practice of Indigenous and Native peoples all over Turtle Island, which many Indigenous peoples call North America, and also in the Pacific Islands. It is a way of acknowledging the fact that there are many kinds of relationships that make it possible for us to exist together, to gather together, and to survive in this world. So it's a political practice of acknowledging relatives at the beginning of every gathering. It's also a practice of solidarity that Native and Indigenous peoples have asked non-Native and Indigenous peoples to take on in order to acknowledge our own relationship to Indigenous land, but also in a more explicit way to acknowledge that that land still has its legal status as stolen and occupied by colonial states like the United States, Canada, Australia, and other nations. And also acknowledging that we want to de-erase or re-visibilize the realities of Native peoples, their history, their contributions, their present organizing, and their future victories against colonialism. So with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and dive in. It is pretty much impossible for us to name, acknowledge, or analyze any system of oppression or exploitative hierarchy in the United States or on the land that's colonially occupied by the United States without acknowledging the material basis of that oppression. The material basis of that oppression, in no uncertain terms, is the theft of Indigenous land, the past and ongoing policies of displacement and genocide against Native and Indigenous peoples, and a culture that erases Indigenous peoples, their histories, their cultures, their political contributions to this land, and even sometimes goes to the point of celebrating the culture of violence and acts of violence that were required to violently and colonially occupy this continent. That is part of the land acknowledgement, but the main part of the land acknowledgement is acknowledging the land that I am on. So I am tuning into you today, coming to you today from New York City in Brooklyn, New York, but that is a colonial name. It is a Dutch name, in fact, because the Dutch were some of the first European settlers of this area of Turtle Island. However, for thousands of years before the Dutch even knew that this place existed, it was stewarded and occupied by the Lenape people, and still is. So Lenape means the original people in the dialects and languages of Lenape. The area is known as Lenape-Hoking. Lenape-Hoking means in the land of the original peoples. Here in colonially New York City, this is the land of the Canarsie and Rockaway Lenape tribes. And so this is their territory. However, the center of Lenape culture and history is further to the south in what's now colonially New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, the Delaware Bay, the Delaware River, and the word Delaware themselves are all colonial names for the Lenape people. And so the Lenape nations that exist on reservations around this country oftentimes will name themselves as the Delaware Nation, but they also understand themselves and name themselves as Lenape. This area that I am in is pretty shaped by the geography of the Hudson River. Of course, not going to be a surprise that the Hudson River is another colonial British name. The original name of that river is Mahicantuk. Mahicantuk means the river that runs both ways, or the river of many waters. And it's called that because it's actually an estuary. An estuary is an outlet from freshwater source into seawater or saltwater ocean. And so in this case, it is the waters of Mahicantuk coming from the lakes and the bays further north down into and meeting the saltwater of the Atlantic Ocean. And so the areas that the Canarsie and Rockaway and other Lenape and Munsee tribes occupy and their ancestral territories are basically an archipelago in an estuary of the northeastern United States. Because of that, there is an extraordinary amount of biodiversity. There are lots of different kinds of fish, different kinds of birds, different kinds of plant relatives. And the Lenape stewarded all of those relatives to create agricultural forests and fisheries, as well as connected different nations all over Turtle Island through diplomatic and trade routes that stretched through Lenape-Hoking. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous streets, definitely in New York City, but also possibly in the United States, and maybe one of the more famous streets in the world, Broadway, is originally a paved Lenape trail that stretched from the bottom tip of the bottom southern tip of the island of Manhattan, another Lenape word, all the way to what is now Mashpee Wampanoag territory, colonially known as Boston. It's also true that the Anishinaabe and Shawnee, two other great nations of this Turtle Island, refer to the Lenape as the grandfathers of their people, or their grandfather people. And so we are starting to see, based just on this story, some of the vast interconnections across the continent that the Lenape were responsible for holding, were part of, and participated in. Let's go to the next slide, Chika. Thank you. Because of the extraordinary infrastructure that was held and stewarded by the Lenape people, this area has been and still is a crossways and gathering place for Indigenous peoples from all over the continent and beyond. Even today, New York City has, I believe, the second largest population of Native and Indigenous peoples in the continental United States, outside of Los Angeles. And so that is not a consequence of the legacies of colonialism. It is a consequence of the infrastructure, the diplomacy, the economic connection, and the cultural relationships that the Lenape have been holding and still hold to this day. A manifestation of the return and resurgence of those relationships in this area is that the black corn, also known as sesaping in Lenape dialects, is a specific species of corn that the Lenape have grown. And that is growing now on the island of Manhattan for the first time in about 300 years. I am deeply, deeply inspired by that. You can click one more time, Shweta. I'm deeply, deeply inspired by this legacy of resilience, resurgence, and resistance that the Lenape people have held in spite of being displaced, terrorized, first of all, in their ancestral lands, and then displaced across the entire continent in multiple phases. In spite of that, Lenape people have been able to maintain not only their life ways and their cultural ways and some of their relationships, but also are one of the few nations in the Northeast and on the eastern coast of Turtle Island to retain their national sovereignty, as in their identity legally and federally as a tribe. And so there are Lenape Nation reservations and Delaware Nation reservations across the continent in Ontario, in Canada, across the colonial border, in the colonial state of Canada, in Wisconsin, and I believe the largest Delaware Nation is in Oklahoma, in what's traditionally been known as Indian country. I'm deeply indebted to this legacy of organizing by the Lenape to maintain their life ways, their cultural ways, and their sovereignty. It is true that I would not be able to be speaking to you about the things that I am in the place that I am without their organizing work and without their legacy. And so I am inspired by the sort of ongoing work of the Lenape to also work with them and be in solidarity with their people to end colonialism and to end all of the colonial relationships of domination that the hundreds of tribes on Turtle Island experience with the United States government, whether they are recognized or not. To wrap up this sort of section, I really love this quotation from Joy Harjo, who is a member, an enrolled member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and is also the Poet Laureate of the United States, the first Native woman to be the Poet Laureate of the United States. She wrote, "We are still America. We know the rumors of our demise. We spit them out. They die soon." I am just so constantly inspired to continue this work, knowing as a matter of fact that I am in a coalition that is hundreds of years old and thousands, if not millions of people strong. So I always like to say, this is not the end of the land acknowledgement. As a matter of fact, all of our work together is to acknowledge and rematriate and return land. So with that said, we're going to move forward. I'm going to pass it back to Shweta. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Malcolm. Yeah, I always just feel so inspired every time I hear this quote and also witness the way in which you do land acknowledgement, Malcolm. And it makes me think about how much of our content today and what we're going to be talking about is fundamentally about connecting the threads between a recognition of US as a settler colonial state and how that actually shows up in the work that we do and in our analysis, right? So it's not just this token gesture that comes up at the beginning of an event now, but it's a truly, it's a central tenet of the work we imagine ourselves doing. So with that, just wanted to, briefly introduce, Race Forward, the organization that's putting up this webinar. Race Forward is a national racial justice organization that really works to transform institutions and grow power for Black, Indigenous, and communities of color through culture, narrative, policy, and research. And some of the ways in which we have been doing that is through our Colorlines work, which is our online media publication, through our biannual Facing Race conference, which I still haven't been to live, but hope to next year. Mass Freedom, which really holds our abolition and decarceration work, as well as our Government Alliance on Race and Equity that really holds our inside work with local governments in moving racial equity forward. Specifically, the race and webinar series, the programming that we are putting on today, really came up in the context of the pandemic and the racial justice uprisings last summer. And with the race and webinar series, we really seek to sharpen racial justice analyses, especially through root cause work, as we'll seek to do today, as well as delivering content that explores intersectionality and connectedness of racism with various issue areas. And so really the goal is to build solidarity across movements and deepen our strategies through political education, through root cause analysis of structural racism, and to address intersecting oppressions as a result of it. So I want to quickly sort of introduce ourselves before moving into the actual content of the work today. And I really also just want to share that, we really do take this time to, really have a deep land acknowledgement, tell us, a little bit about ourselves, because this is movement building work, and it is important and valuable to spend some time together, really ground setting before getting into the deep end of the content. So my name is Shweta Murthy. My gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm calling in from the colonized lands of Kickapoo and Potawatomi, also known as Chicago, Illinois. I'm the research director here at Race Forward. And really what pulled me into this content and into this work of US exceptionalism today and over the last several months with Malcolm is because I grew up in India. I grew up in one of the sites of US empire. I grew up, around 9/11 and the US wars in Afghanistan, and then subsequently in Iraq. It was my politicization happened as happened in a region which was experiencing US imperialism and US wars of aggression. And at the same time, as an upper caste, middle class person growing up in India, I was also witnessing as well as perpetuating the ways in which Indian settler colonialism and Indian exceptionalism based on its hegemonic intent was also happening. And so it's really important, personally really important to me to sort of build solidarities and build connections between justice and liberatory movements happening across the world, but also to really think about how we do this work at the seat of empire and at the heart of empire and at the heart of these polities that seek to exceptionalize themselves and therefore seek to delegitimize dissent and delegitimize liberatory movements that are seeking to upend these settler colonial states, right? So that's sort of what brings me into this particular work today. And want to pass it off to Malcolm to give a deeper introduction of themselves and what brings them to this work today as well.
Thanks, Shweta. Like Shweta said, my name is Malcolm. I use they, them pronouns, as I said earlier. I am a social justice educator, a political educator as well, an organizer, and an activist. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., which is occupied Piscataway Nacotchtank land. And it's actually in growing up in D.C. that gave me much of the beginning of my politics. I grew up in one of the few neighborhoods that was named after the original indigenous peoples of this land, Nacotchtank. That area is now known as Anacostia. it is an area that experiences a lot of over policing and over attention when it comes to incarceration, policing, things like that, right? But then when it comes to other things like clean drinking water, employment, public programs, that area of DC is frequently divested from, ignored, or erased. And so it was growing up in the capital of what is supposedly one of the wealthiest, most powerful countries on earth, and seeing extraordinary deprivation, poverty, and oppression that actually caused a necessary contradiction in what I think about the politics of this country. And a lot of the people, a lot of the Black people around me who raised me also had that same understanding of national politics. And we could even call it our racial politics as Black people in Washington, DC. So that pushed me into asking hard questions, and then pushed me into doing things about some of the answers that I found. And that's led me on a journey here. I most recently worked at Race Forward for 4 years as a senior trainer and content coordinator. And so that's some of my professional work. I'm really, really excited to come to talk to you all about this. I started off as an organizer in the peace and anti-war movement in 2003, when the United States went to war with Iraq for a second time. And so I'm just was so happy that that was also kind of Shweta's also radicalization moment. It turns out that we kind of just were on parallel tracks in very, very different places against the broad impacts, the broad negative and violent impacts of the US military and US foreign policy and US imperialism. So I'm really, really excited to, again, talk to y'all more about that today. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Malcolm. Yes, the geriatric millennial politicization. So we wanted to ground all of you all today in, some desired outcomes, from this webinar, where again, the broader context being, Robin D.G. Kelly says, political education really important, and if the starting point of our political education is that the US is a flawed democracy, then we're not at a good starting point for building our analysis, right? So really what we want to do with this webinar today are a couple of things. One, we want to develop some shared language around how the US normalizes and erases its status and legacy as an empire. If we're doing racial justice work in the US without recognizing that we're at the seat of empire and without having, an anti-imperial, anti-colonial analysis, then our solutions are going to be pretty limited and not in alignment with global liberatory struggles. To that end, we want to deepen our understanding of really what US exceptionalism means and what gives this idea power. The phrase US exceptionalism is something that we've probably heard before, we've probably used it before, but how do we bring it into our analysis? How do we really give meaning to that phrase and really think about how that intersects with white supremacy and racism is something that we seek to do with this webinar. And finally, we seek to provide some tools and frameworks for challenging this paradigm, right? Like, how do we begin to culturally and politically tell different stories? How do we shift our analysis, our racial justice analysis, to better incorporate our knowing of the US as a settler colonial state and our knowing of US exceptionalism to actually giving that power and meaning in our work. And so to that end, we've the agenda for today, we've sort of gone through the introduction and overview already. And for the next bit of time, Malcolm will lead us in a grounding of what is US exceptionalism. I'll lead you through some storytelling frameworks to help us understand what kind of storytelling has perpetuated US exceptionalism, as well as what has constantly been undermining and resisting those stories that are told to us. We will then go into the section which the title of which I absolutely love, No Racial Justice in an Empire, and then we'll do some Q&A and closing. So I'm going to hand this back over to Malcolm.
Awesome. Let's dive right in. So first, to start off, we have a poll. Shweta, you can go ahead and launch that right now. So the poll asks the question, which of the following statements would you most agree with? So the first option here is the Constitution of the United States provides a solid political foundation for the nation and should not be changed. Second, the Constitution of the United States is a flawed but well-meaning document that can and should be reformed. Third, the Constitution of the United States is fundamentally racist, but it's what we have and we should reform it. And fourth, the Constitution of the United States is fundamentally racist and cannot be reformed. So let's take, let's say 30 to 40 more seconds to find the poll. If you're not finding it, and go ahead and vote. It looks like we're at 50%. So I will come back when we are sort of at critical mass here. Let's take 5 more seconds. We're at 85% here, which is pretty good. Awesome. So we can go ahead and close polling now with 86%, 88% accounted for. It looks like the majority, the vast majority actually, responded number 3. The Constitution of the United States is fundamentally racist, but it's what we have and we should reform it, right? So we don't ask this question to decide to see which one of you have the right opinions, right? So the reason that we wanted to start off with this poll is because the Constitution of the United States is constantly and so frequently held up as the pinnacle of political planning in world history, as one of the main things that makes the United States supposedly function so well as a country. And yet we are constantly arguing about and constantly trying to amend even the Constitution because of the many ways in which it provides a foundation for exploitation, for oppression, for land theft, and for genocide. And so in many ways, so many of our arguments about the Constitution really speak to some of the underlying anxieties that folks have about the contradictions of living in a country that makes certain claims about itself, but really is unable or unwilling to live up to those claims in reality. However, sometimes it doesn't even matter what those claims are, because what tends to step in those moments are myths and mythologies. The idea being, one of the myths being that the Constitution is a perfect document. And this is actually a foundational legal idea in the originalist interpretations in our legal tradition. So you'll find people as high as the Supreme Court claiming that the Constitution is a semi-perfect document that should be consistently amended to make it more perfect in order to form a more perfect union, to quote one of those documents. I can't remember which one right now. So let's move to the next slide here. I might just start saying next. It's not because I'm not appreciative of the work that Shweta is doing. It's just because please is going to be a unnecessary word some of this time. So these are some of the questions. It's in the preamble. Thank you, Miguel. There are some questions that really underlie why we wanted to create this presentation, and more than why we wanted to create it, why we thought that it was necessary to create a political education session about US exceptionalism. It's one of those long words, like intersectionality or neoliberalism that requires, I think, a little bit more exploration, but is no less important because of how long it is and how many syllables it contains. We have some really clear questions we can ask. Why is the United States allowed to posture as a leader of the free world while occupying stolen land? Why does so much of our mainstream politics in the United States elevate civil rights when we're talking about this country and name human rights when we're talking about other places? And why do US-based racial justice movements have so little to say about the US status as an empire? The contradictions of this get more concrete if I'm going to tell a story, right? Let's rewind maybe to January 7th, 2021, the day after, I think, the riot and storming of the United States Capitol, the sort of seat of legislative power in the United States. There was a lot of hand-wringing and word and ink spilled about, is the United States a failed state? Is this the end of the promise of the United States? Has authoritarianism won in the United States? Now, we could engage in answering all these questions as well, but I think one of the important things to name is that what many of these questions do is distance the United States from the realities that many people around the world experience when they're thinking about their own political systems. If you were to turn on CNN or MSNBC right now, as a matter of fact, you might be hearing about authoritarianism in places like Cuba, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Bolivia, Lebanon, right? Places where human rights are an extraordinary concern for pundits and other human rights activists who are based in the United States and given mainstream platforms. However, there are plenty of places also experiencing human rights abuses that are not getting talked about in the mainstream. And oftentimes that simply has to do with the fact that those countries are allies of the United States. And therefore, when it comes to our conversations about human rights and civil rights, it's less about what rights are actually being broken or not. Instead, it's about the geopolitical positioning of certain countries as enemies or not, right? And so this is one of the ways in which a global structure that the United States is trying to determine on behalf of its own interests actually then filters into how we talk about our rights, what we deserve, and our political systems here. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a video to actually illustrate some of what we're talking about. So instead of talking more, I'm just going to let the video play. This is Jen Psaki, who currently is the press secretary of the White House. But back then, in 2015, she was the spokesperson for the State Department. And this is her denying that the United States was involved in a coup in Venezuela, and in fact denying that the United States is involved in coups ever at all in other countries. Let's listen.
President Maduro last night went on the air and said that they'd arrested multiple people who were allegedly behind a coup that was backed by the United States. What is your response?
These latest accusations, like all previous such accusations, are ludicrous. As a matter of long-standing policy, the United States does not support political transitions by non-constitutional means. Political transitions must be democratic, constitutional, peaceful, and legal. We've seen many times that the Venezuelan government tries to distract from its own actions by blaming the United States or other members of the international community for events inside Venezuela. These efforts reflect a lack of seriousness on the part of the Venezuelan government to deal with the grave situation it faces.
The U.S. has, whoa. The U.S. has a long-standing practice of not promoting, what did you say? How long-standing is that? I would... In particular, in South and Latin America, that is not a long-standing practice.
Well, my point here, Matt, without getting into history, is that we do not support, we have no involvement with, and these are ludicrous accusations.
In this specific case.
Correct.
But if you go back not that long ago, during your lifetime, even. This is
The
not
last
that
21
long
years?
Well done. Touche. But I mean, look, I don't know. Does long-standing mean 10 years in this case? I mean, what
Matt,
is,
my intention was to speak to
I
the
understand.
specific reports.
But you said it's a long-standing U.S. practice, and I'm not so sure how It depends on what your definition of
We will,
long-standing is.
okay.
We can pause here.
Whatever we say about Ukraine, what
So the rest of this video is exactly what the first part of the video is: journalists laughing at her and for saying such a blatant lie, and asking her different examples of when the United States has literally intervened in the democratic transition processes of other countries. I could literally just sit here for the next hour and a half and name countries, and that would take up all the time. That's how much intervention and interference we are actually talking about in terms of history. But that phrase that Jen Psaki, I think, kind of dismissively uses without getting into history is one that we should obviously use as an opportunity to dive into. Let's move to the next slide here. Because when it comes to
President
thinking
Maduro last night
about,
went on the air
one more
and
time.
said that they'd arrested multiple people.
Yep. We at Race Forward, among many other social justice organizations, social justice movements, racial justice movements, thinks that it's important actually for us to consider history. It's pretty impossible for us to think about what we've done in the past, what we need to do in the present, and what we should do in the future, as a matter of fact, without using history. And anybody who was, I don't know, in this country 10 days ago, kind of maybe can understand how important history is to the United States when they're not trying to wriggle out of accountability. So if you click one more time, Shweta, one of the things that we use to counteract this kind of, we could call it negligence, but what it really is accountability avoidance. What it really is a performance of impunity, i.e. I can do whatever I want and you can't do anything about it. One of the ways that we fight against this is by using analysis and by doing root cause analysis to find out what our organizing strategy should be. And so the framework that Race Forward uses breaks down what's happening underneath the surface of these individual isolated, seemingly isolated moments of racism. And underneath the surface, what we see is actually that there's much more going on that can possibly be explored. Our conversation in the United States oftentimes limits racism to an individual on individual conversation and defines racism as individual intentional acts of malice. However, that is actually a very tiny proportion of what racism actually is. Oftentimes, when we see that, those might actually be the symptoms and not the causes or roots of racism. And so when we're thinking about structural racism as the big thing that it is in our society, we isolate culture, the normalization and replication of everyday racism, history, the roots and cumulative impacts of white supremacy, interconnected institutions and policies, and also racial ideologies, those popular ideas and myths that perpetuate racial hierarchies. We identify those as actually being underneath the surface of many of those moments of individual intentional acts of malice. And as a matter of fact, what's also true is that US intervention in places like Venezuela, Chile, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Iraq, Laos, India, Indonesia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Nigeria, et cetera, actually cannot necessarily be classified as individual intentional acts of malice because they are acts of state. They are acts of foreign policy. They are legally sanctioned, even if they are not right. And so therefore, it is in many ways in Jen Psaki and the State Department's interest to erase history in a conversation about US imperialism. That is exactly what Nicolas Maduro at that moment was accusing the United States of, imperialism. And in order to avoid being somebody who would be seen as an imperialist or being a state that would be seen as an imperialist, Jen Psaki was like, let's not get into history. Well, that's exactly what we're about to do. Next slide. Imperialism as a history has actually, let's go back one more. I want people to see these photos, these pictures. Imperialism as a history has shaped our world in ways that cannot possibly be denied by anyone who is choosing to use any of the faculties that are given to us to analyze and experience reality. On the left, we have a photo, or I'm sorry, a drawing of Cecil Rhodes, who is I believe a a magnate, a diamond magnate, yes, on the African continent in the early 1900s, who was British. And he actually has multiple colleges named after him. He had 2 countries named after him. What's now Zimbabwe and Zambia were both Rhodesia when they were British colonies. One of the most prestigious scholarships in the world, the Rhodes Scholarship, is named after Cecil Rhodes. He was also one of the largest and most well-known supporters and actors of imperialism on the African continent. And that's one of the reasons why he is credited with bringing civilization to the dark continent. So that would be the continent of my ancestors with thousands of years of history that invented political centralized states that created monotheism. Yes, that Africa. So he brought civilization to us, mostly through telegraph lines and colonial officers, of which he was one. On the right, we see Teddy Roosevelt, who is a former US president, in many ways picking up the same idea that civilization is something that is brought by white people to places that are non-white for their benefit, and that there's no internal or non-altruistic interest that any of these imperialist, mostly European or European-run powers have in acquiring land, in pushing people off their land, in coercing different governments to allow their military presence in their territories, etc. On the right, we have a political cartoon from the early 1900s that is specifically one of the first US occupation of the Dominican Republic after the Spanish-American War. This would be the time actually that the United States was acquiring the colonies of Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, the Samoa, and the Philippines, which actually meant that at that point, the US had more colonial subjects outside of the territorial borders of the United States than inside of the territorial borders of the United States. Now we can click. Imperialism is one of the ways that we describe this. And yet, it's so rarely is the way that we describe these same actions in the United States today. The occupation or extension of territory through indirect or direct means. And so there's a specific reason for that. So we wanted to just define imperialism here. We know that that's another one of those long words that requires a little bit of introduction. Imperialism is, as a matter of fact, the extension or imposition of power, authority, or influence over another nation by a nation. US imperialism specifically refers to the policies that are aimed at extending the political, cultural, and economic influence of the United States over areas that are beyond its own boundaries. And yet, we can click forward again, we need to, I think, take a little bit of skepticism with even the definition that's being offered us by US imperialism. Would the United States exist, period, without an extension of borders? Is it possible for the United States to have ever existed without the policy of extending its own borders into other nations? Were those nations France, Germany, the Dominican Republic, Chile, or India? No, they were the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, the Kickapoo, the Sioux, or Dakota, right? The Apache or Diné people. These are the nations that the United States chose to occupy and use imperial influence over in order to create what we now think of as the continental United States. The United States itself is a continental imperialist project that we have naturalized. And so this is actually from this painting is one of the examples of the stories that we have told ourselves about this history of territorial imperialist occupation and acquisition by the United States. We always hear, remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo. The idea being that it was a moment of the United States defending its territorial sovereignty against an encroaching and invading Mexican army. However, let's click one more time. That was not actually true. The reality is that the Alamo was an occupation by settlers from the United States of Mexican land on behalf of extending slavery, the institution of chattel slavery, into Mexico, where it had recently been abolished by the Mexican Revolution. And so the Tejanos, who were Davy Crockett and his ilk, who were supposedly defending the Alamo, were, as a matter of fact, themselves occupiers who were being thrown out by a Mexican nation that itself was occupying many indigenous lands and many indigenous nations. However, the legacy of naturalizing this as a moment of US defense against Mexican aggression is part of the exception that we're talking about. The United States has crafted an exception for itself from the generalized understanding that when you conquer someone else's land, that makes you an imperialist, that makes you a conqueror, and it means that when they throw you out, it's what you deserve. That is what gets erased in these histories. US imperialism, as in the conquest and coercion of different peoples and lands, is the structure in which the story or myth of exceptionalism places itself. And this, we can actually see this exceptionalism leads to people not understanding why exactly Indian country is still used today as a term by the US military to refer to any combat theater. So as recently as 1991, as recently as the 2000s, actually, US military generals were referring to places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Thailand, Laos, etc., as Indian country, because there was places where the United States military goes to fight. Also, one of the first things that was said about the murder of Osama bin Laden, both to Barack Obama, and then Barack Obama also then repeated this phrase, was Geronimo is dead. Geronimo, the famous Chiricahua Apache political leader and military leader who was forced to concede to the United States, but the Chiricahua Apache and Jicarilla Apache and other nations that came together to fight the United States, though they were actually, his name was then used as a code name for any large enemy of the United States. And so Osama bin Laden's code name for the US Marines when they went to kill him in Allahabad, Pakistan, was Geronimo. Let's click one more time. We would not be able to talk about US exceptionalism without naming Manifest Destiny. So Manifest Destiny is the ideology or system of ideas whereby the United States just was supposed to have the shape that it has today. It was the destiny, it was the United States' destiny to occupy the entire broad swath of the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and any conquest of native and Mexican or all indigenous lands between the Atlantic and the Pacific is thought of as progress and not imperialism or colonialism. And this, to cite, this is from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is just one of the most famous historians in the United States, a feminist activist of long standing, as well as an activist of the American Indian movement as well. Let's move forward here. And so when the idea of manifest destiny disappears, that's when we just get remember the Alamo, just as a general calling phrase that we're supposed to just always care about here. So US exceptionalism, according to the New World Encyclopedia, is the belief that the United States differs qualitatively from other developed nations because of its national credo, its historical development, and any distinctive or political or religious institutions that it has. I might amend this to say that exceptionalism in the common sense, people aren't just comparing the United States to quote unquote developed nations, but to any nation, right? As a matter of fact, it's a lot of times that the United States is comparing itself to global South nations in order to keep track of its own superiority and supremacy. Let's move forward here. One of the things that we want to name is that it's a system of beliefs and a concrete political structure. It exempts the United States from the laws or norms that govern other countries. So it's not only the norms, don't conquer when you're not supposed to, don't go to war without any good reason, use the international legal institutions like the United Nations to pursue peace. It's not just those that it's exempted from, but also the laws. The United States is allowed with impunity to say that other countries are undemocratic and to use that as an excuse to invade, dismantle, or destroy them. Secondly, this belief that the United States' military and economic supremacy in certain ways entitles the country to moral and political leadership. These are not necessarily things that should be equated, and yet consistently are. And so these are some of the stories that we are constantly telling ourselves about the United States that then sort of concretize into phrases like remember the Alamo, never forget, land of the free, etc. And yet some of the, even those of us who don't necessarily use those phrases sometimes fall into some contradictory stories that we tell ourselves, like that this is the land of the free, or that this is a young, innocent nation, when in fact, that is simply a story that we tell ourselves and a story that we must repeat to one another in order to make the actions of the United States make sense historically and seem reasonable and consistent across time. So I'm going to pass it to Shweta to dive a little bit more into like, so what does it mean, stories? So we want to offer a framework for thinking about stories through a racial justice frame that can deepen our understanding of what US exceptionalism is and how it functions.
Thank you, Malcolm. And yeah, just to sort of add my 2 cents to this, there is a notion of US exceptionalism, but we are also seeing, if we zoom out, we are seeing sort of this solidarity of settler colonizer exceptionalisms, right? We are seeing the solidarity emerging between the US, India, Israel, all of whom are, on different parts of their journey around settler colonization. And a lot of the narratives around these exceptionalisms and the entitlement to moral and political leadership or immunity of these actions, the legitimization of state violence against dissent, against actions of occupied people, is also really rooted in Islamophobia. And it's rooted in sort of these really racialized and these racialized languages of sort of being the only democracy in difficult neighborhoods and so on, right? So we're not going to dive into that super deep, in this space, but it's just some questions that are emerging for us as we dive into US exceptionalism and really thinking about the connection between US exceptionalism or a country's sort of exceptional narrative and the way it feeds into their empire building and their settler colonizing project. So just wanted to kind of add that. So as Malcolm mentioned, we're going to take a step into some storytelling frameworks for racial justice, and really thinking about how storytelling, both sort of analyzing what stories already exist that prop up US exceptionalism, as well as what stories have constantly been undermining and resisting, this ideology, this system of thinking, and just using that as a vantage point of analysis. So we borrow this framework from the storytelling project curriculum. And since I'm pretty steeped in the Asian American movement spaces, I'm going to use more examples from those spaces to kind of to illustrate this framework. So we'll start with stock stories. Now, stock stories are stories told by dominant groups. They are passed down through history, literary documents, through mass media, through public rituals, through the Constitution, through the laws, through arts, education, and media. And for the purpose of talking about US exceptionalism here, what stories, sorry, tell us is what a society considers important and meaningful, right? And so for the purposes of US exceptionalism and understanding how stock stories prop up US exceptionalism, we think about the way in which the American dream is normalized, right? And also that piece around historical amnesia and the way in which we don't need to apparently care about history in order to understand the role of the US domestically as well as internationally. From sort of my experience as an immigrant from India in the US, the first stock story that I interacted with after coming here is that of the model minority myth, right? And the model minority myth really is such a prevalent stock story that really covers up so much of the racial trauma enacted against different Asian American communities in the US. It just props up this monolithic community as this perfect community of color that is abiding by and able to achieve this American dream, right? And it really doesn't allow for any immigrant community, in this case, Asian American communities, to have histories that are beyond what began after we landed on these shores. And it's really, and it's important to know that this stock story around the model minority kind of connected with stock stories around the American dream and pulling yourself by their bootstraps, but there was intent behind the model minority myth as being propped up in the time when the war against Black and Latino communities, in particular in the context of the quote unquote war on drugs, was happening. It was meant to weaponize Asian American communities against Black and Latino communities in particular, to show that there could be a quote unquote good community of color that could achieve this ahistorical American dream in this colorblind society, right? And so the purpose that stock stories have served in the context of US exceptionalism is really erasing the racial trauma through historical amnesia and normalizing the American dream, and really imposing a very particular restrictive framework through which communities can tell their own stories. And so looking at stock stories then is a really helpful point of analysis for understanding how US exceptionalism operates domestically. So as you'll notice, as we progress through different kinds of stories, we start thinking about where the margins of rebellion and the margins of dissent really lie. So concealed stories are actually stories that are buried, forgotten, repressed. They're just under the surface. They're challenging stock stories all the time by offering different accounts and explanations of what was going on. We're just coming off a long weekend that celebrated a settler colonizing holiday. And if your social media was anything like my social media, everyone was sharing Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," right? And that is a really great example of a concealed story that that is coming from the margins of society, that is coming from the experience of oppression, that is really challenging this stock story of the 4th of July being this incredible sort of achievement in American history. And it really brings, it's a very successful concealed story that brings to the front or brings to the fore how Black communities, or how, like, what is the importance or lack thereof of this holiday for Black communities, right? We think about, I think about, I think about oral histories. I think about all the stories that we hear from one another in social justice spaces, at tables with our families, around how really, the experience of racism and life was, that is different from what stock stories tell us about our communities and about our histories and realities, right? So there could be, let's say, as an Indian in the US, there'd be stock stories around sort of, Indians at owning Dunkin' Donuts, or owning, hotels, and, all these stereotypes and stock stories around how Indian communities came to be, and the places they occupied in this country, including our, current president making jokes about Indians and 7-Elevens and Dunkin' Donuts in his, good old fashioned gaffy way. But really, the concealed stories that, let's say, come up in Vijay Prasad's Uncle Swami, the book, are really around what did cause for these kind of ethnic enclaves, or what kind of economic segregation forces led to the creation of Koreatown or Japantown, or Indians occupying certain positions in small businesses. One of the reasons that Indians owned highways, owned small motels across highways, was that nobody wanted to operate a business in an environmentally unsustainable, highly polluted area. And so those were the gaps in the economy that, these migrant communities that were economically segregated out of mainstream economies occupied. And we wouldn't know this unless, if it wasn't for concealed stories and oral histories of our communities sharing it with one another. So the next is resistance stories. And if, for those of us who are active in racial justice spaces, these resistance stories we are more familiar with. These are stories that demonstrate how people have resisted oppression. It is about people who've visibly and in documented manners challenge stock stories that that support oppression, and so on. So so resistance stories of, Yuriko Chiyama and Malcolm X, coming together in solidarity in New York, or resistance stories of Asara Shakur, of our community organizing histories. I feel like in so many community organizing spaces, we create histories and timelines of events and things that happened, that we've won, that we've lost, in order to really ground ourselves in the history and current sort of progress of our resistance. So to me, the distinction between concealed stories and resistance stories are more that resistance stories are more visible, they're more documented, they are more accessible, as opposed to concealed stories that are more hidden from public view in that moment. So one of the great resistance stories that I actually learned about recently in the context of Asian and Black solidarity is the story of David Fagan, who was this Black soldier who was a private in the US Army, who was sent to the Philippines when the US was aggressing on the Philippines. And David Fagan basically deserted the army and said he wouldn't fight this fight. How many of us knew about this? We know about Muhammad Ali and Muhammad Ali sort of dissenting against the war in Vietnam, but Muhammad Ali was participating in the legacy of David Fagan, who then had a $600 bounty on his head because he deserted the army and refused to sort of fight in the war of aggression in the Philippines. And lastly, and this is sort of where there are opportunities in concealed resistance and transformational stories, but really where I see the value of, the desired outcomes of this webinar today are in transformational stories. These are stories that we are building right now that are built on the critique that we've developed off stock stories through concealed and resistance stories. It is transformational stories is where it's at, where we're creating these stories to design new actions. So what are the transformational stories that we can create that are built on the basis of anti-imperialism, of anti-colonialism, of anti-racism? What is the opportunities here for our racial justice movement analysis happening at the seat of empire to be in alignment with liberatory struggles in other parts of the world? I was in a webinar with amazing sort of anti-militarism youth organizers, and they were talking about the silence of US racial justice movements on imperialism, right? And they were talking about building the connection between defunding the police and defunding the military, and anti-policing and anti-militarism. And so what are these transformational stories that we can build is sort of where I definitely see the opportunity for this webinar, right? And transformational stories are also important in helping us helping us tell better stories about ourselves. A lot of times when we're telling resistance stories, they can also sort of fall along sort of patterns of US exceptionalism, where we can say, oh, like we can only do a certain type of work in this type of country, which is a flawed democracy, but at least it's not, X, Y, and Z. Resistance stories can fall into sort of some predictable patterns of blunting our own radicalism, of let's say, for Asian Americans, for thinking about ourselves as these depoliticized passive people who have a hard time getting to the front lines, as opposed to really connecting with our histories of radicalism, of our history of both being imperialists as well as being colonized, and really inviting ourselves to tell stories that don't just begin from when our communities either forcibly or through various forms of coercion landed in these shores, but to really be connected to what kind of transformational stories we can tell that are really in line with the struggles of our ancestors, as well as our comrades in other parts of the world. And so we're not going to go into sort of a deeply, like a long reflective moment here, but just sharing some reflection questions with you all to sort of take away as you enter into the second half of our webinar, which is, do we know our histories? Do we know each other's histories? Do we want to? Do our stories of ourselves only begin after landing in the US? Why, or what does that mean? Which resistance stories can we create and uplift into transformational stories? And in terms of eking out and designing our transformational stories, how can we resist normalizing the US empire? And I think there's a lot of conversation and community building and story building that can happen, if we think of these questions. And just to sort of give acknowledgement where acknowledgement is due, some of these questions come from Heijin Shim, who's an amazing Asian American abolitionist who's been doing a lot of work in provoking Asian American movement spaces to think more deeply about our stories and why we are doing this work today in the lands we call the United States. On to you, Malcolm.
Thanks so much. We can go to the next slide. I really so deeply appreciate the real specificity of being able to use a sort of not like a specific community, even though, that community is like a huge proportion of the world, Asian Americans, Asian and Pacific Islanders, to talk about how the stories that racialize Asians and Asian Americans are also then filtered through and woven through the same sort of erasure of US imperialism, erasure of the impacts of US militarism abroad, the erasure of class conflict within and among Asian and Asian American peoples that depends on this sort of land of opportunity thesis, right? So really, really appreciating all of that. I think how that shows up then for those of us who are doing racial justice and social justice organizing is that it leads to a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? So our goal here is not necessarily to say that there are folks who are, yes, there are actually arch imperialists, there are active imperialists, and then there's also the rest of many of us who live in an imperialist country and who simply are organizing technically against injustice, but may still be socialized into, who may still have internalized some of these ideas. And so it leads to some cognitive dissonance around the US as what I and other people are starting to call an empire of freedom, kind of almost jokingly, right? Because it's those two things cannot necessarily coexist. An empire, by virtue of being an empire, coerces certain people into being inside of that empire. In many other cases, it may even coerce them into allowing an occupation of their land such that the boundaries of that empire extend to include their land and those subjects. None of those are democratic or free processes, right? And so this is a contradiction in terms that many of us are constantly feeling like we're swimming around in, sitting on a fence between, balancing ourselves among, feeling like we need to be true and clear about the history that it is, that we're inheriting, and the society that it is that we're actually live in, which is one of racism and extraordinary violence, while also balancing that with an almost, one could call it a naive optimism about the future of what the United States can be. At the same time, we could also call it a symptom of US exceptionalism, that these contradictions seem to either get smoothed out without actually getting addressed, or they simply get ignored for the convenience of us messaging ourselves to, I don't know, whether it's lawmakers or the supposed general populace, which is oftentimes coded for white beneficiaries of imperialism, or even sometimes when we're messaging ourselves to our funders, that can end up becoming the actual political analysis and language of the movement when folks are beholden to funders. And when those funders themselves are beholden to the ideas of patriotism, that means that oftentimes folks are doing intellectual backflips in order to fit them or pretzeling themselves into a shape whereby we or they can acknowledge imperialism while not acknowledging it too much, because it would become inconvenient for the conclusions and strategies that we are crafting. And so some of the contradictions manifest in the language of the optimism of doing racial justice work, in hope for making the country better, when in reality, we also need to understand that that hope that we're talking about for the country is hope for the empire, which is not to make you feel bad, but just to make us be clear. We're hoping for reform in an empire. And then once we have to just say that and admit that that's where we're coming from, it seems not only maybe a little bit ridiculous, but sometimes that it may even be doing the work of US imperialism on behalf of the United States. We have other phrases like, we can make the country better, or there's a constant thing, this quotation from James Baldwin, I criticize the country because I love it so much, right? We see that a lot. And again, while that is a position that some people can have, it is not the necessary position for us to always take. That's my point here. The idea that we criticize the country because we believe in it. Sometimes we criticize the country because we don't believe in it, because it's not a reasonable project, because it is inherently a violent undertaking. And those of us who have those opinions should not be marginalized within our social justice movements. We should actually be forming the core of the analysis and strategy that we have. You know, whether or not you let us write the grant reports is up to you and up to the collective. So we're going to move to another activity here where we're going to concentrate a little bit more on language. Though, to be clear, we also want to make sure that we're holding the reality that this, yes, is about language, but is so much more than language. It's about a political system of impunity. So what we're going to do is look at some of the language that expresses that system and that excuses it. So this is a word cloud activity. Oop, the thing is going a little weird. Oh no, bring it back. So Emmy, one of our folks, just put a link in the chat to Menti. And what you can do if you click on that link is what we'd like for you to do is just to type in some phrases that you have heard or used or read that reflect these ideas of US exceptionalism that we have been talking about, that reflect some of this cognitive dissonance and some of these contradictions. So I'm gonna, Shweta, I think I'm gonna let you put on some music and then we're gonna spend just 5 minutes doing some reflecting and writing here. Wow, what a beautiful word cloud it is we have here. So I'm really, really grateful for all of you for contributing here. I'd love if folks can just start putting in the chat, what are some of the words that you see here that you may not have written, or phrases that you may not have written, but that stand out to you, that you were like, whoa, I didn't write that, but that absolutely applies in the situation. What are some of those words? Go ahead and put them in the chat. Go ahead and type them in the chat. Some of the ones that are standing out to me, global superpower definitely is a phrase that gets used a lot, a global superpower. Uniquely positioned, ooh, that's a good one. Uniquely positioned, this idea that the United States is unique or so individual that we couldn't possibly hold it to the standards of other countries, or that we have held other countries to. Meritocracy is definitely coming up here a lot. You strike up, please.
Yeah, I'm also seeing name a better country, and I remember how like so many dissenters are challenged on, you know, on how, where else could you be able to say what you're able to say. So it's just looking at that. Folks are pointing out melting pot, for sure, land of immigrants. That's pretty ahistorical. Yeah, US exceptional phrase.
Thanks to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She is actually coming out with another book after Indigenous peoples' history of the United States. Well, she's prolific. She has many books, but a new book that she has just come out with, or is about to come out with, is called Not a Nation of Immigrants, and is specifically about challenging this mythology that we are a nation of immigrants. This melting pot idea is really fascinating to me. I would really recommend, if folks are interested in diving more into that idea of the melting pot, that you should read Nell Irvin Painter's book or excerpts from it called A History of White People. She talks a lot about the origins of the term melting pot, which I believe were actually in some play called The Melting Pot, that was a way of normalizing and assimilating Southern European and Eastern European immigrants to the United States during, I believe, the teens and 20s, so that the United States could be a better military power during World War I, and then during World War II. So we're seeing, right? There are just so many of these. I feel like we could go through for those of us who are here from organizations, or who are here and work with collectives, you might even be able to go through some of your statements, either your racial equity statements, or your mission statements, or your vision statements, or your websites even, and see if there's any of this language that you're seeing. See if there are any of these moments where this contradiction, this cognitive dissonance about being an empire of the free is actually making it into the racial and social justice visions that you all have, which means that in some ways that our horizons of possibility are being limited by what US imperialism decides is appropriate for us. This one here, Is America Possible, can be especially galling because that comes from the Black freedom struggle, Vincent Harding specifically, who did not necessarily believe that America was possible. So that one can be especially, but should we ask open-ended questions if we're going to answer them? Is the question that we should also be asking. All right, let's move back to our presentation. That's awesome. I want to keep that word cloud for future use. What's next here? So to give ourselves a review and to move into sort of a conversation where we talk about what US exceptionalism does in the sort of cycle, one of the things that we've already named is that there's a manifest destiny thinking that celebrates breaking treaties with Indigenous peoples and celebrates wars of aggression. I use those two phrases very intentionally. According to, back to the Constitution of the United States, treaties with Indigenous nations are the sovereign law of the land. So that means that manifest destiny thinking actually celebrates breaking the law of the Constitution in order to make the United States function. So let's try to square that circle. The reason that I use the phrase wars of aggression is because that is a formal legal phrase in the Nuremberg treaties after World War II that actually made wars like the ones that Nazi Germany and the Third Reich fought in Europe, or that colonial Japan, Imperial Japan fought in East Asia and Southeast Asia, that makes those wars actually illegal under international law. Now, I'm sure we can take one or two guesses as to the global powers that were exempted from this idea of wars of aggression. It was in fact colonial powers. And so one of the main contradictions that comes from this US exceptionalism and its broader, maybe mother, Western exceptionalism, is this idea that colonial powers don't fight wars of aggression. They fight to bring civilization to the rest of the world, right? And so those don't necessarily count as wars of aggression. Granted, the Japanese Empire thought the same thing, but because they are not a European power, or were not the winners of that specific war, they did not get to determine the terms on which their actions were reasonable and legal. And so the wars of aggression is one of these weird in-between phrases that colonial powers created to make sure that their colonial holdings could never be stolen from them again. The second part is that we have historical amnesia and willful ignorance that enables some of these claims of innocence. That we folks get to say, oh, we're a young country because that simply means 1776 and on, 1787 and on, 1790 something and on, as opposed to the British, Dutch, Spanish, French colonialisms, genocides, anti-Indigenous terrorisms that actually enabled the United States to come into being and to maintain itself as a state over and above and against those Indigenous peoples. Finally, we close the loop when the United States or representatives of the United States and what the United States has done are no longer able to erase or hide or excuse the violence. What they do is they normalize it through a rhetoric of necessary evil. Let's move forward and we can see some examples of this. So let's talk about historical amnesia and willful ignorance. This is kind of an extreme example, but at the same time, not one. So this is from last year during the presidential election, when at that point, candidate Joe Biden made the claim that Donald J. Trump was the first racist president ever elected. Now, I don't quite know how one could make this claim. Shweta, you were saying it's one of his like gaffe-friendly kind of things. I sometimes believe that. And then this specific clarification that they have, his campaign later clarified that there have been several racist presidents, is actually where we get to some of the intellectual backflips. Has there been a non-racist president of the United States? So we have to think about the understatements that come even when we are talking about supposed temporary allies like Democratic politicians. Let's move to the next slide here. This necessary evil rhetoric normalizes violence in multiple ways. One of the ways is that people believe that that since the United States is a good and a force for good in the world, that anything that allowed or allows the United States to exist must have been necessary or excusable in the light of history. So the idea here is that history is not necessarily a moral thing, and that we can't judge people in the past because they were, quote, products of their time. What this does is normalize us not paying attention to, let's take, for example, Tom Cotton, Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who said that slavery was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built, the United States. Much of this, sometimes we hear that the quote founding fathers, capital F, were products of their time. So the fact that they held slaves, committed rape, committed genocide, believed certain things and did certain things that they did is not supposed to disqualify them from the moral leadership that they still maintain over our country after almost 300 years. However, what that does is marginalize and erase the perspectives of Indigenous and African people who already knew that slavery and colonialism were moral evils. And so it actually asks us to pretend that Indigenous people are not real, that Indigenous people don't have actual opinions, and that those opinions cannot shape how we think about people in the past, right? And while we may think of this as reprehensible, I would ask us how many of our organizing visions and organizing strategies think that the genocide of Indigenous peoples was a necessary evil upon which the country was built. Many people are now saying out loud and maybe coming to an understanding that slavery was not a necessary evil for the United States, but many people definitely believe that Indigenous genocide was a necessary evil for the United States. If we believe, for example, that the United States would not exist without evil, what does that mean about what we think about the United States? Can we, in fact, finish the sentence and make 2 + 2 equal something, as opposed to just saying 2 + 2 forever? Another example is from Madeleine Albright, who excused the deaths of 250,000 Iraqi children as victims of US sanctions, saying that she thought the price was worth it, the price being 250,000 Iraqi children's lives. And so this was during the sanctions regime that she imposed or was responsible for upholding and imposing on the Iraqi state during the 1980s and 90s. So this is these are two examples of how, both in terms of United States history and US foreign policy, in more recent times, that necessary evil rhetoric normalizes this kind of genocidal violence. Yeah, we can move forward. This brings us to another point here. There's another, that this kind of thinking is not just a double standard. It's not just that some of us are given more leeway than others, or that some of us experience discrimination. It is, in fact, that words and terms like terrorist are actually invented to normalize colonial violence. They're invented to create a separate category of violence that non-Western people do that is somehow wrong because it's not on behalf of civilization, not on behalf of capitalism, not on behalf of stability, not on behalf of the negative freedoms that are supposedly guaranteed to people in the United States on behalf of civil rights. So we can press forward a couple more times here, I think 3. Yeah, it reflects some of this racial bias that the United States and Western countries, France, Germany, the UK, et cetera, don't conquer for the same reasons as like China would, or conquer for the same reasons that the Soviet Union or Russia might, or conquer for the same reasons that Iraq might in Kuwait, but instead conquer on behalf of progress. This creates an exceptional category of progressive violence that helps us avoid root causes of the actual violence that we face. Both the people who don't have the power of the state and the people who do have the power of the state are using colonial violence against the working class in order to shape the world for their own aims. And we should be able to name that as grassroots organizers. We should not necessarily tie ourselves to, this is where I'm getting into Malcolm opinion and less analysis, I apologize. But as Malcolm, I am saying that I see a lot us tying ourselves more than we should to states as a nation states or governments and what they do and what they can do and how they can free us, instead of seeing all of the violences that the working class experiences around the world that create refugee crises, that create famine, that create gender violence, that those are all in fact consequences of struggles around colonial acquisition and colonial territory and former colonial power. We can move forward now. So this is another video from more recently. One more time, yeah, here we go. This is from more recently, and it basically is Joe Biden saying pretty much the same thing as Jen Psaki in a different way. So let's watch. Oh, we have an ad. Sorry, y'all.
State-of-the-art eye exams, high-quality lenses and frames. Because everything we do at LensCrafters is for every sight that makes your life special. Book your annual eye exam now. LensCrafters, because sight.
Now look, one of the consequences that I don't know, I shouldn't say this, unfair of me. I suspect you may all think doesn't matter. But I'm confident matters to him, I'm confident matter to him and to other world leaders of big nations. His credibility worldwide shrinks. Let's get this straight. How would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries and everybody knew it? What would it be like if we engaged in activities that he is engaged in? It diminishes the standing of a country that is desperately trying to make sure it maintains its standing as a major world power. And so it's not just what I do, it's what the actions that other countries take, in this case Russia, that are contrary to international norms. It's the price they pay.
Yes, President Biden, what would it be like if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with their elections directly? What would it be like if everybody knew about it? As a matter of fact, that's the world we already live in. That's the world we already live in. The rest of the world already knows that the United States interferes regularly in the elections of other countries. As recently as the Obama administration, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, was very, very, very upset at the United States for tapping her phone lines and monitoring the conversations of a head of state in the EU because they wanted to make sure that she was doing the right things, I believe, to staunch the flow of refugees from Syria. And so these are the kinds of, one of the privileges of US imperialism is the privilege of being able to go around the world and claim exception wherever you go. The idea that the president of the United States is able to go to another country and lie so blatantly, maybe by omission, but lie about what the United States does and has done and not be held accountable for it is because of a structure of impunity. To be clear, this is very, very similar to the kind of to what Ida B. Wells, a famous Black journalist from the United States, called lynch law. Lynch law is a structure of impunity in United States history and even today, whereby anybody who claims that Black people are doing a certain thing, either breaking the law or in the case of Ida B. Wells' time, simply doing something that was against the culture of US apartheid, that meant that that person deserved to get murdered. The idea here that certain countries deserve to get overthrown and that hundreds of thousands of their people deserve a lowered quality of life, deserve for their buildings to get bombed, deserve for their cities to be destroyed, deserve for their cultural and historical sites to disappear and to be looted and taken to the British Museum and the Smithsonian, that those are things that countries deserve because the United States says they are undemocratic. And because organizations that are funded and supported by the United States go on the United States' word and say that by virtue of being a non-democracy, those countries do not deserve their own self-determination. This is a pure and simple colonialism. Pure and simple colonialism. The fact that we don't name it as such is a consequence of this structure of impunity that allows civility to power holders while guaranteeing the rest of us the impacts of their actions. Let's move forward. What's going to play again? We're going to get another advertisement. Hopefully everybody is checking in on their eye health these days. Oh no, this one's about hotels. So we move from there. I say, and the last thing I want to say here is that we oftentimes aren't as on our toes about this kind of stuff as we want to be, not through the fault of our own, but through another process that was one of domesticating social justice movements, of actually making it difficult for people in the United States to be, and if not sometimes illegal for people in the United States to be in solidarity with others around the world. I'm doing a time check and I am over time, so I'm gonna simply say that I would encourage you all to look up some of the things that are on your screen right now. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1952, which created certain criteria for deportable aliens, one of them being communism, or being a communist. There was the counterintelligence program, which actually led to one of the first domestic terrorism charges in the United States against a Black nationalist organization in the 1980s that had been affiliated with the Black Panther Party. And then also the prosecution of the Holy Land Foundation 5, who were accused of aiding and abetting terrorist organizations simply by virtue of doing charity work. So some of these are examples of how racial and social justice becomes not only inconvenient or impossible, but also actually illegal according to the United States. And so in order to undomesticate ourselves, rewild ourselves, re-internationalize our movements, there are some concrete things that we can do that aren't just about the words that we use. We got to organize against the international political systems of impunity, like the UN Security Council, which allows former colonial powers to veto the democratic, we could say, resolutions that are forwarded by an international group of nations. Or we could hold the US accountable to returning the land that broken treaties are addressing themselves towards. We want to explicitly name and redress the racial exclusions and whitewashed histories. So this may be about words, but sometimes may be about the actions that we take as well. This webinar is an action that we took to redress the racial exclusions and whitewashed histories of the United States. And we also want to destigmatize anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism in racial justice organizing. So now we're gonna move to a question and answer section. And I am very, very excited to see these questions.
And just by way of sort of the last point, I think Malcolm and I were really deliberate in using the word destigmatize anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism as the way forward, right? Where again, to us, there is, it points to the ways in which US exceptionalism has been socialized and internalized in our movement spaces, where even though we talk about colonialism and imperialism as students of history, it sort of remains just as superficial land acknowledgements do. It remains on slide 1 at the beginning, but doesn't actually show up in the rest of the work. And there does seem to be, political, economical forces and factors that prevent us from really asking those questions. It is easier, it is more optimistic to start from a point of view of a flawed democracy rather than starting from the point of view of a settler colonizer state and US as empire. So we just wanted to share that, using the word destigmatizing was a very deliberate use of word on our parts as the last thing we wanted to send you away with.
Such an important point. Transfer facilitation. Do you want me to read out the questions and then we can decide? Or do you want to read out the questions? I don't really have a preference here. I forgot which we decided.
Why don't you read out the questions and we can figure out who wants to answer what.
Awesome. So our first question is, can you speak to how global capitalist companies like Amazon and Google contribute or are related to imperialism and US exceptionalism? Great question. I have a couple of ideas in mind. Do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so Amazon and Google are literally as large as some nations. So that's the first thing that we have to name. Maybe I'll do imperialism and US exceptionalism separately. So Amazon and Google both occupy stolen land in the United States. And by virtue of doing so, there are many ways that they have to advertise themselves as also being great for the world. Lots of tech companies and large multinationals actually pick up some of the language of US and Western exceptionalism because they operate under the idea that the land that they are stealing to make space for their plants, the environments that they are destroying, the gentrification is all worth it because they are bringing something worthwhile, i.e. civilization, to the rest of us, right? And so in that way, they're absolutely involved in US exceptionalism because there's no way that coming from the United States, they could have a completely altruistic or history-free interpretation of what that positive impact is supposed to be. In terms of then like how they're impacting workers, I would say that mostly the way that I can think about it in terms of imperialism is that both Amazon and Google are constantly fighting antitrust laws around the world, antitrust laws being laws that allow them to prevent other companies from competing with them in other parts of the world. I believe that Google is being sued by attorneys general around the US and also being sued currently by the European Union for that exact reason. When it comes to imperialism, Amazon and Google both are crafting and creating artificial intelligence technology that security firms around the world are using to do things like tag and track immigrants, make sure that people's passports cannot be forged or faked, to make sure that workers, no matter what language they speak, what cultural norms they have, or where they're located in the world, have to abide by the US norms of work culture in order to be given a positive work review and performance, because those are the norms and practices which have been determined to be best for producing value and profit. And so those are a couple of ways that I can think of. Yeah.
And I want to sort of broaden the universe of global capitalist companies beyond the Amazon and Google as well, right? Though with, of course, we're seeing the different ways in which Facebook and Twitter and so on are cooperating with the state. They have a very different relationship, let's say, with the Indian state compared to the US state, right? And are hand in hand with the Indian state to to identify dissenters and to reveal information about dissenters, and so digital security is becoming more and more important as a way of countering the way in which international solidarity is being criminalized, right? So to Malcolm's one of Malcolm's point around the way in which racial justice work is being domesticated through criminalization of solidarity activities, capitalist companies aren't just occupying land occupied by indigenous folks and doing resource extraction, but they're also working hand in hand with several fascist strategies to criminalize dissent. So I think that's really important as well. Important to consider as well.
We've only got time for, I think, one or two more questions.
One
So I'm going to do,
question.
yeah. So I really want to answer this one about how do we wrestle with what sometimes feels like competing futures within our collective movements? Because I feel like that's one.
Yes,
That's one about multiracial solidarity, right? So this is, there's some specifics in this. So how do we wrestle with what feels like competing futures within our collective movements? The example here given is reparations versus settler repatriation. So is it land back or is it reparations? Reparations, does reparations include stolen land or not? And so this person says they're particularly thinking of this through a frame of settler colonialism within the United States. Although I would say that this is a great question because it applies to not just the United States. Yeah. Shweta, do you want to start with this one? Since I started last time.
Sure. I mean, I think that's the, I just want to endorse the question. Like I looked at the question and I was like, yes, that's the question of transformational stories, right? So I don't particularly have an answer to that, but to say that these are the kind of questions that we have to ask ourselves. I definitely, think that, in sort of in reparations work and in thinking about, particularly with reparations work, US exceptionalism sort of shows up in terms of, again, having a much more sort of localized analysis as opposed to sort of situating, the violence and harm against Black communities more globally in the diaspora. So the question that, so not an answer, but a question that comes up for me from this question is, what would the reparations discourse look like, or what would be the opportunities of a reparations analysis that is actually global in understanding violence and harm against Black communities, as opposed to, very specific localized analysis. And it's something that is actually coming up in the space of climate reparations, right? Because you can't draw artificial political borders on climate change and environmental justice issues. And when we talk about the question of what does reparations for climate catastrophe and and climate change related violence look like, you have to have a global lens, because this is kind of speaking to the previous question around the role of capitalist companies and so on. This is the role of the harm enacted by imperialism and neocolonialism that we need to seek reparations for. So those are just some of the initial thoughts that are coming to my mind on this question. So more questions really, not answers.
I think I would encourage us to look to the some of the originators of these movements. I would say that reparations is absolutely not a national conversation. Reparations in its current manifestation in the ways that people are talking about it has been, I think, commandeered by people who would like to domesticate it as a demand. But when I was growing up, reparations was mostly led and forward by an organization, NCOBRA. And NCOBRA is a Pan-Africanist international, Black internationalist organization that actually does believe that it's not just the United States who owes Black people in the United States reparations, but in fact, it is all colonial and former colonial powers who participated in the transatlantic slave trade, who owe reparations to all people of African descent, because the entirety of the African diaspora and the entirety of the African continent was destabilized and forced from its own history by the reality of the transatlantic slave trade and by the history of the transatlantic slave trade. France, as far as I'm concerned, as a Black person in the United States, France owes me money. So that's one way to look at it, is that actually these are internationalist movements, and therefore they actually do complement each other. And that's because the reparations movement is a land back movement for people of the African diaspora so that we can get the land back that was stolen from us by the transatlantic slave trade. The ideals and goals of reparations were domesticated by the US government in order to actually cover for colonialist powers and to cover for themselves. In the same way, indigenous groups in this part of Turtle Island are hardly asking for only the land back within the borders of the United States, because then guess who wouldn't get guess who wouldn't get a lot of their land back? The Comanche would not get a lot of their land back. The Apache would not get a lot of their land back. The Hopi and the Wahwetakans would not get a lot of their land back. The Cree would not get a land back. The Crow, the Blackfeet, the Dakota, the Haudenosaunee, the Kickapoo, all of these nations straddle colonial borders. And so these are absolutely not, to say that we're in competition with one another as communities over what the United States government gives us and grants to us is to limit the horizon of what is possible in ways that are much, I think, insidious than the people who originally forwarded the demands for reparations and land back actually had in mind. And if it seems like huge because it would bankrupt and end the possibilities of the United States and Canada, for example, existing, that's only because, as we said before, it's only by virtue of doing these things that the United States and Canada exist today. I hope that answers the question. So we are at 4:59. It kind of seems like the perfect time to close. How does that feel, Shweta?
Yes, and I wanted to first close with thanking them for the attendees to making it such an active space. Thanks so much to our behind the scenes tech team, as well as our ASL and captioning folks. For the attendees, we really wanted to highlight a couple of things. One, youth organizing really is at the forefront of anti-militaristic implementing critiques of US exceptionalism into their organizing work. And so if you wanted to come and check out what youth organizing is up to, Race Forward is organizing a Race and Our Present, Our Future on September 25th. The amazing Isra Hirsi is the keynote speaker, so please register and join. Malcolm and I, in fact, are going to come back with a part 2 of this webinar sometime in the fall, where we are going to organize a panel of people in the United States who are doing this work on the ground, where we want to talk to them about what US exceptionalism means for them, and how is anti-US exceptionalist, anti-US militarism work showing up, or analysis showing up in their work. So stay tuned for more information on part 2 of this webinar. And yeah, we shall close it here. Thank you all so much for joining us.